here. And if there's anything in the chat, we can help you out by reading it out. We'll pop it out on the screen as well.
This is gonna make this easy.
Just like applause react only.
It's too late for this. It's too late.
Yeah, it's done. Oh, well, that's great.
Like, yeah.
The order of the words would be
Check the capitalization.
From the cradle to the grave.
Lena, there's a bit of a gap between you and that. Oh no, that looks kind of better there. Oh, just saying. Rapid. Hey.
Nice.
Hello. Is this on? Yeah.
It is on, yeah. I was just going to ask you to do a mic check, so that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Oh, flaps down. I think this is my normal speaking voice. If that's not too quiet. Okay.
Oh, so as we're talking, can we pick these up and then?
Exactly. That's your bias.
Yeah.
50 minutes older than
Also, where should I look?
I think
Welcome.
All right, well, bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue. Welcome online and in person to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thanks so much for joining us for this roundtable discussion that looks at the intersection between intimacy and research creation with participants from the Digital Intimacies Pop-Up Expo here at Fourth Space, day one. So exciting. We are streaming to YouTube live from Fourth Space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Jagé, Montreal. And we would like to extend our gratitude to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation for the caretakers for the lands and waters we're meeting on, for their teachings about the earth and our relations. At Fourth Space, we work with our community here at the university to connect people to ongoing research projects and initiatives brewing at Concordia through activities that invite engagement with the goal of mobilizing and sharing knowledge. And today, it's our pleasure to work with the Research Creation Collective, collaborating across Digital Intimacy, Gender and Sexuality Lab, otherwise known as DIGS, and the Feminist Media Studio, FMS. We're so excited to have all of you in the space with us today for this initial conversation, getting us warmed up for the week. We can't wait to hear from all of you. I'll just mention to the folks who are joining us online on Zoom or on YouTube, if you'd like to speak, if you have a question or a comment, just feel free to raise a virtual hand. We'll call on you so that you can just speak. Otherwise, pop your comments in the chat and we'll read them out for everyone to hear. And of course, if you're in the space, I'm just reminding you to use the microphones, the handheld mics that are there for you when you speak. And for audience members, we'll grab one and get it to you if you'd like to join in the conversation as well. Okay, that's it for me. I'll pass it over to your moderator, Sabrina. Now, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to, also online and offline, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Intimacies Pop-Up Exhibition. I'm very excited to be here today. And I did have a land acknowledgement planned, but Fourth Space so nicely did that, so I'm going to move on to kind of allow everybody at the table to introduce themselves and just give like a one-sentence title of the project that they have today and at the workshops during this exhibition. So I'll start with you, Hannah.
Thanks. Thank you. Hi everyone. Yeah, so my name is Hannah Schallert. I'm a first/second year PhD student in the Communication Studies department. And I worked with collaborators as a filmmaker on the dance film behind me, 100 Years of Cinematic Solitude in 300 Moving Pieces. And it's a dance film composed of chronologically organized excerpts of movement sourced from the performances of women throughout the history of world cinema.
You can just go around.
Hi, my name is Chris Vilvang. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Communication Studies, and my project was luckily enough selected as the backdrop for our talk today. It's called Graceland, and it is 153 pictures that I took at Graceland, the home of Elvis Presley. And I ran them through the Apple Photos Memories AI feature to see kind of how the curation system would process the images. And what I found is that the images are kind of privileged in certain ways. And what I'm hoping is that when we look at them all together, we can see kind of patterns and preferences within the system to see why certain images were selected and others weren't.
Hi, I'm Alina, and I'm a fourth-year Communication Studies PhD student. My piece here is called Hayabusa 108, and it's the 3D scanning experiment in the back. And basically, it's sort of a 3D scanning experiment I did while on the Hayabusa line in Japan, which is Japan's fastest bullet train. So I was interested in kind of the effects of what would happen if we sort of used 3D scanning apps to sort of document sort of the journey between two major cities. Yeah, I'll pass it to Ben.
Thank you. My name is Ben. I'm a third-year PhD student in the communication department. My project is called Intimate, Private, Anxious, and it's a photography project that also uses Google Street View technology to consider intimacy and how it's also publicly mediated.
Hi, I'm Jessie Stainton. I'm a first-year PhD student in the communications department. My piece is a textile and sound-based installation called Chipping Away at the Bitterness, and it's looking at, or it's taking found objects in Montreal and New York and making prints of them, rust dye, and then making a sound installation based on field recordings from the site.
Hi, my name is Kristen Lewis. I am a second-year PhD student in the Department of Art History. My piece is Sonic Reticulum, and it's a combination of auscultation recordings through a stethoscope microphone and spoken word, and its reflections on digestion and rumination.
My name is Raphaël Besset-Vien. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Humanities program. My piece is titled Touch It, Touch It, Touch Me. And it's a mix of 35mm film and digital video. And I'll be hosting a workshop this afternoon where I'm going to be working with participants on 16mm film, and that will be integrated into the piece starting tomorrow. So it's an evolving piece.
Hello, I'm T. Braun. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Humanities department. And my piece is called Aggregate Multitude, and it's a collaboration with Marie Hinson, who's an artist, performance and sound artist based in New York, and also known as hex.exe. And in our piece, we're exploring queer disorientation, orientation through VR, sound, and writing. Of course you do.
Thank you, everyone. It's great to learn a little bit about everyone's projects. And I guess because of the nature of this whole exhibition, I'll start with like a very broad question that I think everybody can probably answer in different ways, is how are you thinking about intimacy in relation to your work?
It's already on. Yeah, so for me, well, I think for all of us, the collective started meeting and thinking about intimacy through the critical inquiry special issue on intimacy, and started with Lauren Berlant's introduction to that special issue. And for me, in my own piece, I'm thinking about intimacy And because of us reading that together, started to think about intimacy and how it's determined in this sort of public sphere, and how there's different, whether it's state policy, the church, marriage, all these different sort of institutions of intimacy that are kind of at odds with how we conceive and understand intimacy. And so for me, my work in taking photos of the family home in a suburban area and a more sort of urban area is thinking about how we go out into the world, whether it's work, school, to a museum, and we participate in public life. And we then go back home and assume that place to be intimate and private, when really there's a lot at hand in sort of determining what that place is and how we think of it as intimate. Even as we're in Quebec, we think about, cheap daycare, right? And why there's cheap daycare. And we think of these, what we might think of as a sort of intimate private spaces, sometimes not. And it's often very sort of publicly mediated and determined. And so for me, my project, in terms of actually going out and taking photos, I kind of started getting into night photography because it's a bit more challenging for myself, especially when working with film, right? There's very long exposures, and there's this kind of moment of having to actually wait while taking a picture for it to click, right? For the shutter to go and for that exposure to be done. And there was a sort of moment of contemplation for me, and this space that for me felt intimate, and where I was starting to think about the family home in a more sort of critical way. And then throughout that, also reading Lauren Berlant's piece that she wrote in that critical inquiry issue with Michael Warner, Sex in Public, I started to really think about the family home in a different way and how it's thought of as an intimate space, but is it really? So that's kind of was really central to my work, to my piece.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. I started with rust and dyeing with rust in my textile piece. And for me, that's really about an intimacy with these found objects. And it stemmed from my frustration at just the amount of development and abandonment and kind of working within these spaces that are private but public at the same time, like construction sites, abandoned sites. And for me, that kind of stemmed from a personal intimacy, but then engaging deeper after reading Lauren Berlant's work, I really wanted to kind of map an intimacy of the process through sound. And that's where the sound piece comes in. So kind of taking these very specific moments of discovery. Like at one point I have my 2-year-old nephew is helping me make one of my pieces. And so I include like a snippet of him and kind of honoring these processes and these intimate moments of creation that are not always apparent just by looking at something or engaging with it.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess my piece kind of builds on the same theme that everyone's talking about challenging the divide between what's public and what's private with the intimate. And that's like really amplified because I'm thinking about like reflecting upon like my own personal lived experience, and reflection is an intimate private experience, and how about if I record myself speaking about that. And then also my gut sounds, like those are things that are private to me and don't normally get broadcast to other people. And by making my exhibit kind of like something that you can walk into, you're hit with my digestion from 3 different speakers, and then me reflecting on digestion and reflecting on experience and digesting experience. So it makes that otherwise intimate, private, personal experience public and shareable, and hopefully meaningful for that reason.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think with my project, with our project, I worked with my collective called Immer Collective. I can't remember if I mentioned them earlier, but we're kind of, I think the first way that we're engaging with intimacy is intimacy and embodied research. because it's a dance film and it's a piece of choreography that's created. There's 300 different clips of movement that the choreography is developed from. So creating that choreography requires time of sort of sustained study with the movement, replaying the clips over and over for the dancer to learn, and so that she can do it all from memory when she goes to perform it. But also in terms of creating the score in the first place, we had to sort of source all these clips online and spend a lot of time scrubbing through them and finding the moments. So that's an embodied process where we're looking for the different movement signatures and putting them together and creating a choreography from that. So it's kind of this idea of you learn and research about something with your body by being close to it and spending a lot of time engaging with it, not just in a visual way, but also an embodied way. And then the second way I think that we're engaging with intimacy is also through cinema as a form of intimacy through looking, or a technological intimacy and closeness. Of course, often talked about in terms of a gaze, and since it's a piece focused on the history of women in world cinema, male gaze. But of course, people have talked about how that's not, that often that theory sort of makes women an object in the film, but we are looking more so at the ways that women from lots of different places in the world, lots of different experiences, how their particular embodied sort of training and knowledge comes out in the movement. So we're looking more so for a way of getting closer to that through embodied research and all different kinds of looking and gazes in different cinematic traditions. So yeah, I think those are the two kind of ways we were thinking about it.
Yeah. Intimacy functions in this project on a few levels. I think the first and kind of most obvious is the idea of touring someone's home. It's a fairly intimate space, and yet it's become this highly visited, highly publicized, famous landmark. But that's just kind of the backdrop for this piece, which is about kind of larger themes. And I think a lot of the talk around everyday photography today focuses on social media, and I'm more interested in our kind of personal and private interactions with the media we create, the stuff that we don't end up sharing, the stuff that doesn't get commented on. We're aware that our Instagram feeds are shaped by algorithms that are targeted towards, certain outcomes, yet we may be less aware that even in our personal encounters with our personal media, how we interact with it is being shaped by various forms of algorithms, artificial intelligence, what have you. And I think that really actually shapes how we come to know ourselves and understand our own stories and our own narratives. And I'm also just interested in what it means to kind of share something that is personal and see what other people can see in my own intimate, private, not specifically private in this context, but see patterns that, that I'm maybe too close to the content to actually identify myself, and see how other people react to it.
Yeah, I think also something we as a group have kind of discussed in thinking about intimacy has been how technologies themselves kind of mediate new forms of intimacy. And I think for me, that's been a central line in my thinking, at least for my project. I came to kind of 3D scanning through really this emergence of these newly available kind of mobile media apps that now really put kind of this technology just in your pocket. So I was really interested in kind of how these technologies that are now really accessible and really open to the public can kind of allow new ways of kind of embodied and engagement with space and kind of spatial storytelling as well. So this experiment was done on the app called Polycam, but there's numerous 3D scanning apps out there that are available on your phone. But yeah, I'm sort of interested in kind of how these newly available, now public technologies can really function as kind of these counter-resistant methods to this technology that once was very inaccessible and that once was really tied to kind of these, I guess, discourses of kind of colonialism, extraction, really tied to kind of drone-based, sort of top-down kind of ways of seeing the world. So having kind of these 3D scanning technologies in your hand, I think, can really open up. I'm very inspired by kind of feminist and also indigenous ways of thinking with these technologies and thinking about kind of volume and volume research generally. Yeah.
You're right, there's a mic right here. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I think something that has been so important to this process is our conversations as a group. Like, it's not just a show with a bunch of artists who work with similar themes, but really being in conversation was so great. And what you're saying about what do these technologies open up, whether they be analog technologies or new technologies, how do they allow us to, see traces of intimacy? But I think also, well, then, is there a new or broader definition of intimacy itself that's coming up through these practices? And do we become intimate with the technology in a new way? I think is also a really interesting question that we're engaging with on different levels. Within my own work, which this piece is a part of, I'm part of kind of an underground community of queer people in social virtual reality. So it's all about not virtual reality as a singular experience, but all about relationality, intimacy, intimate practices, love practices, like the things that people engage in through these technologies. And I think initially when I got into this world, I thought like, okay, so this is a stand-in for being in the physical world with another person. But what was so surprising is that there are other forms of relationality and embodiment that arise through these technologies, and love goes through the wires. And if I wear my headset for 5 hours a night, as I do sometimes, like, what does it mean to have this thing on my face, touching my body? It's wired. So I'm dancing with the wires and kind of navigating this virtual space and this physical space simultaneously. So it becomes really, I don't know, maybe I guess kind of post-human, or it's this form of embodiment where there isn't a sharp delineation between my body and the technologies that I'm wearing.
Yeah, those are really interesting questions too. I'm also very interested in these kind of continuities between bodies and materials and materiality, and that's why I kind of turn towards more analogous ways of making, but they're never separated from the digital either, right? The analogous and the digital kind of like cohabitate together. And then regarding the question of intimacy, something that I was thinking about this morning, so this is like a tangent, but I was reading over again Berlin's text, and Berlin talked like drawing on feminist, like basically she kind of like reshapes what feminist work has done already, like around the question of like this division between the public and the private, right? It's not such as divided as we might think it is. There's continuities between both, and in the intimate is also always part of the public world. But I wonder about like the reverse of when intimacy is forced, like when we expect, or like when, and I'm thinking specifically of the moments of coming out or of like self-declarations. I'm thinking here of terms of like gender. So in the situation of transgender and queerness, in certain forms of non-visible disability, and when people from different racialized or culturalized backgrounds don't appear as being racialized, as pure as white. So all of these kind of situations that like bring people to kind of like have to self-declare, and so have to like kind of like open this link of intimacy within the public sphere because of the public sphere being normated, like being normed in a certain way, right? So it's kind of like this reverse notion of this relation between the public and the intimate as well. And so I think about that in my own work too, of like how can we resist as well, or how do we just play with these difficulties? How do we stay with them as well? Yeah, these are like tangents.
Does anybody want to respond to that question before I move on to a related question? But I think this is interesting question, so I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I think this theme here about sort of even in analog work and your work and my work being, starting at this analog place of taking film photos in this project anyways, even there in that space of working with an analog camera, I think I'm so aware of how digital technologies are impacting that experience. And for me, anxiety is very sort of central to this piece in the way that there's so much rhetoric around surveillance because of digital technologies. And how digital technologies sort of open up the world of surveillance. And when I'm, at night taking pictures of people's homes, it's obviously this very sort of creepy, questionable thing. But there's, there's this person at night taking, pictures, and I have internally, I have an anxiety doing it. And of course, being out at night and taking pictures, not everyone feels safe doing that. And of course, I have certain privileges that allow me to, even though I feel anxious, still feel safe enough to be there doing that. But for me, there's still this presence of digital technologies and how they're making me feel in that sort of analog practice, and also how my subjects, though there are not human subjects in this piece, but just generally how people feel about being photographed in public today. So often I'm on the metro or walking around downtown and I see someone take their smartphone out, and I have this tendency to kind of turn my head away and not want to be in the photo, but I'm just looking the other way and there's a CCTV camera just capturing me, right? And so that's kind of part of my project, is so often we're not really considering, sorry, now I'm going off on a surveillance tangent, but still tied to digital technologies. But, so often we're not considering these sort of much more larger, insidious, ways of surveying people, and large corporations that have a hand in doing so. But to go back to my practice, these forms of, not just digital surveillance, but just digital practices, everyday digital practices of taking pictures on a smartphone, have sort of shifted my practice and created an anxiety for me, but I think also in subjects, whether they're people that I'm taking photos of or just people generally. So there's kind of a link there between this analog and digital, thinking. Yeah.
Okay, great. Listening to you all talk, it's kind of challenging my understanding of what intimacy is. And when I think about it, it's like something that is like a personal thing, that you do by yourself, perhaps something erotic or something with one or two other people. It's something that's small, but something that I think a lot of you touch upon is this notion of this collectivity to intimacy. And it first came up for me, Jesse, when you were talking about found objects, because there is this kind of like temporal aspect to collectivity and intimacy in that sense. And Hannah, with you talking about like dance, and then yourself talking about like underground communities or digital underground communities. So I guess this challenges my pre-existing understanding of intimacy, but also I have also read Laura Berlant, and I know she talks about like the commons and how it relates to intimacy. And so I guess my question is like, what does the collective do for processes or states of intimacy?
This is on, yeah. Thank you. I think that's really interesting. And it's funny, I hadn't actually considered how much the collective is so important to intimacy to all of us. And it's ironic because we're a collective working on this. But I think, it's really interesting how there is a collective form of intimacy, but then also I'm still thinking a lot about what you said, Raphael, about how intimacy is forced upon certain bodies and minds because of how, like invisibility, or just also just the way that the world works and what's unsaid, and kind of these neutral spaces that are never really neutral. And I think what I do really appreciate about everyone's work, or it's made me kind of consider how that our independent experiences, like these private experiences of intimacy, are so connected to these larger notions of what it means just to exist in the world. Yeah, I don't know. That's actually all I have. That's great. Anyone want to go?
Yeah, I was thinking about like kind of pulling on a bunch of different tangents, thinking about the intimacy of like sitting alone at home, recording my own gut sounds after just being like, what am I going to eat to make this be the loudest possible so that it's interesting to hear. And then like another part of my own research that's kind of, related is like data collection and how that changes the practices that we do that seem personal, kind of in relation to Chris's work. And I was like, oh wait, like I have to use an application to record these sounds. And where is that information stored? And if you're doing an artistic practice, do you really think about all of these larger kind of questions of like ethics and politics when it comes to just kind of like, oh, I want to make these really interesting sounds. Let's use like the most, technically advanced and thus artistically available piece of equipment, but then it necessitates like using this specific application. So then like the collective kind of comes back in to something that was otherwise, very personal. And then like I reached out to the app company and I'm like, where's my data storage? And they're like, local, it's totally local. And you just have to trust them also that that's true, but you have no way of like verifying. So it's like, you're always mediating between like what you can handle on your own as an individual and how that's kind of taken up and put into other people's hands. And just requires, I think, a lot of trust also.
Which gets to what you were saying earlier about this.
I think one underlying question of this is like, which collective are we talking about, right? Like the collective of like society at large is one type of collective, or working collective is one collective. The folks that I've invited to do the workshop this afternoon is another collective. And each of these collectives or collectivities will ask, require, and have their own understanding of intimacy, right? Or you have different relations of intimacy within these different collectivities. Yeah, that's the end of my thought.
This is just, again, so interesting, all the definitions and openings up of what intimacy is that are coming up around the table. When I think about intimacy, it's always relational to me. There's always a collective that I'm engaging with. And like, yeah, there are these forced intimacies, like that's such an interesting dimension. But for me, it's, I know I'm having an intimate moment when my heart feels soft and open. And I think that's a notion that we rarely talk about when we're talking about like emerging technologies, which can be thought of as so hard, I guess, and so inhuman. And I mean, when I'm thinking about intimacy within my work and within the communities that I'm a part of and work in, like just as an example, I've been doing a lot of interviews with folks who live in those spaces and encountering some people who are neurodivergent or don't leave the house very often for whatever set of reasons, or don't have access to a welcoming community because they live in Texas, for example, and are trans. And for them, being able to gather in these spaces collectively and do things like cuddle virtually, do things like touch one another and have like sensations that are going through their body because of the visual stimulation that is coming up in this world, is radically intimate and opens up a lot. And even other things like, I've talked with people who are uncomfortable with physical touch, who, neurodivergent or on the spectrum or something like that, who are able to experience intimacy there in ways they can't in the physical world, or can control sound, or whatever it might be. So that's a very different dimension, or I guess we're all talking about very different dimensions of intimacy collectively. So I think that's so interesting, the layers. Oh, yeah. I keep forgetting.
Any other takers?
I'll just quickly pounce because I think the idea of that collective versus individual, boundary is very relevant to the kind of broader discourse about artificial intelligence and how it shapes a lot of our more intimate tastes or decisions. I can think about recommending personal photographs. I can think about, music recommendation services or any other thing, YouTube algorithms. And there's this tension between, your algorithm that creates this little niche for you, or does it actually just channel your tastes and your decisions towards the preferences of the many, towards the things that are already popular? And it's kind of this unknowable, right? It feels very clear, like, oh, this is my YouTube algorithm. I have an intimate relationship with what's appearing for me. Yet the way that information is generated is always based on how have most people reacted to the same types of things that you've reacted to. And it's an uneasy debate, right? Like, does it kind of make things more diverse over time, or will we actually all just be watching the same single show that was created by a robot because it pacifies all of us very effectively? I'm not sure.
I think this is very quick, but I think what's so interesting about that and listening to is also thinking of going back to this idea of relationality and collectivity, is that all of those users that they're pulling data from, there's still this idea of collectivity in the process for AI. So I think it's it's kind of interesting when we think about intimacy being this shared thing or this collective process. Their AI is kind of channeling that, even though AI might be one of the very last places we turn to think about intimacy. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, I really like the kind of difference that's kind of happening between these things, where like the technology is kind of producing like an alienation through the individual collective relation, but it's producing like intimacy and like a warm fuzzy experience, like I love that divide. And it just like reminds me of this thing that I'm using in my research, the difference between like producing aesthetic experience or having aesthetic conditioning. And it really kind of, what you were saying kind of brings to mind that dichotomy where the technology is allowing you to have an aesthetic experience or a personal experience, something that allows you to make meaning and share that with other people. Whereas this becomes almost like you're aesthetically conditioned to be like the masses, and you have that kind of, I don't know, trained cohesion. I don't know the word I'm like looking for, but like you lack the ability to kind of like then have an aesthetic experience because you're just told what the aesthetic experience is going to be. And the technology like conditions you and programs you into that little like truth box and hole that you like best fit in. I thought that was really interesting.
It's like this operationalization of like the ways that you express intimacy in a datified context almost. Yeah. And this kind of tension as well in a datified context between wanting to show your own intimacy, but also being almost like not forced, but like coerced into it by virtue of the fact that you're there. So that's interesting. Any other thoughts before I move on to a different topic on the question of intimacy? So while you're all using research creation in different ways in your work, you're also all working in very different topics with different disciplinary or interdisciplinary spaces. So for example, I would imagine the significance for research creation in every space that you're all working in would be different. So it would maybe be different in the context of like disability studies, like yourself, Jesse, as it might be in your project, Chris, working with AI. So a general question for all of you that I think kind of gets to the specifics of each of your projects while also talking about research creation is like, what do you feel the significance of research creation is for your field, discipline, or object of inquiry?
Yeah, for me, when I first was thinking about digital intimacy, one of the first things I thought about was access intimacy, which is a term by the disability justice activist Mia Mingus. And it's kind of getting at this idea of when someone just gets your access needs or kind of like gets what you need or like, and so in my work, research creation, and this is a lot thanks to like the AIM Lab and Arsley Dokumaji, is kind of looking at access as a creative practice and how that we can like create spaces that tend to more access needs. I'm gonna say access a lot in this little tangent, but and that's what I'll be talking about in my talk on Thursday too, is ways that we can kind of shift access from being this add-on practice or something that's very individualized that people need to ask for their accommodations, again, being pushed into this kind of forced intimacy of having to like be made visible by the fact that you have trouble existing in this like invisible norms of the space. And the art gallery is quite rampant for that. It's mostly visual, traditionally, quiet spaces. We're at a university, which has a lot of, ableist connotations. And I think what's really exciting about research creation is having that ability to reframe access as something that's not just this add-on, but creative, and that we can kind of play with, and as messy as disability, and that there's so many different ways to do it. And these are so kind of dependent on the intimate, temporal, spatial vibes that we find ourselves in, lack of a better word. So I guess to finish in my piece, access was something I really thought about in doing a sound and textile-based installation, is that how can I kind of take it from just this visual into like honoring the textures, and also all the different like sensorial kind of experiences that you get from looking at a work. So there is like an image description aspect kind of weaved into my sound piece, and that was really interesting to plan and also incredibly intimate for, I didn't want to use my own voice in it because I don't know, no one likes listening to their own voice. And then having to also like define my work, like, I don't know, it was such this interesting kind of new layer of intimacy for myself, but then also thinking about how I can like bring that into a space. Yeah, tangent done. Who's that?
I think for me, the promise that research creation holds is this sort of opening up of a new or an alternative way of doing research. And I think for me, with my project and thinking about anxiety and thinking about intimacy, how we think about it, how we conceive it, how we conceptualize it, the actual act of going out and taking photos. And, earlier I talked about sort of that long shutter and that moment of contemplation and thinking. In the actual act of, doing research in that sort of way, in taking photos, there's this moment where the anxiety is actually felt for me. And so there's this opportunity to instead, whether it's collect data about anxiety or, collect data in different ways through different methods, or reading, even though I'm reading alongside this, but in actually having an opportunity to feel that anxiety and experience it, there's a new way of understanding and sort of reckoning with it. In one small example with my piece, but I think for me, research creation provides a modality for feeling and doing in sort of a different way. And I know that's talked a lot about by different people that are working in research creation, but in relation to this, to my own project, that long moment that I talked about, or even just the act of being out and having the space to think about it, there are thoughts and feelings that wouldn't have or possibly have emerged otherwise without actually going out and doing it. So I think that for me is really critical in my sort of practice, artistic practice, but also in actually doing the research.
Yeah, I think one of the kind of central features of research creation for me is that it is kind of this very process-oriented, kind of iterative thing. So even when I kind of look at my piece, it's like it's not the finished thing. It's just kind of one step in kind of my thinking forward with the work that I do. And I think that kind of works across everyone too, and even in the context of this collective and this exhibition, and kind of thinking about an exhibition as research creation or workshopping as research creation, how kind of these process-oriented things could be perceived as research creation too, I think is just an interesting thing that we've been kind of thinking about for a year. So yeah, just to say that this has been kind of a process, and I think just process and iteration is like very central to research creation, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, I think definitely this, like some of the things you guys are talking about with research creation being like this as like an an engagement or a process that like takes time and sort of working with things. I think that seems like to me, the research creation, right? So it's you're spending time with something and then making something new from it. And with respect to like my project and how it relates to the fields I'm working in, I think I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier with the idea of dance as a process of embodied research. And that's, I can expand on that a little bit, comes from like sort of backgrounds in dance studies. A lot of that comes from like anthropology and ethnography, and the idea that it's like you go somewhere and you spend time with a thing, and then that's how you learn from it and how you learn about different cultures or different people, and that those groups and people, not just the groups, again, kind of the collective and individual, that's reminding me of that too earlier, that they have different ways of moving, and movement is a sort of a shared language that they have as a group. And this is all, they're all specific to collectives, but also to individual experiences. And that also kind of connects to how I think this method of research creation works in our piece in the sort of field of like film and cinema studies. Again, I think I referenced this a little bit earlier, but the idea of like, in the 70s, there's like sort of feminist film theory, like male gaze theory, but then that was kind of criticized as like, well, that doesn't actually encompass like non-Western sort of ways of like cinematic traditions, or like something that's not heteronormative, and that these are all, it's not just the individuals in the film also have their own like backgrounds and experiences that inform how they move. And so I think like in working with the films and spending time with them and trying to research the movement and then create a piece out of it, it was also a way of like examining these different like ways of moving, but also the individual people, right? All the individual characters in the films. And then using the creative part of like research creation to sort of rework that material and take it maybe out of its movement context a little bit. So there's some of it comes out of the narrative, but then it still retains the traces of that, and then trying to balance that like in a new piece. Yes, my tangent is now over.
Love tangents, it's good.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I'm just thinking about what you were saying at first about like the slow work. That really talks to me in the way that I work as well, because the kind of like principle that I'm following for now is like I work everything frame by frame. So it is like a very kind of like a slow work in what I do, and it brings another, like a different mode of attention, right, to what I'm doing. And then relating to the larger question of like the significance of research creation for the field that I'm working in, principally is the trans studies. I think it's very interesting because it allows to encounter the questions of gender as visual, the questions of appearance, in a way that is different than just thinking about appearance when you're also making things that are visual. So it's kind of like this. It's another engagement with these concepts and with this thinking. It's also another engagement with the question of materiality, and as bodies and as gendered bodies as material. So like one half of my research is also research creation, so I'm making things, and then the other half is that I'm studying how different objects that can be considered like prosthetics or garments come to shape the body. So I'm studying kind of like in parallel the relationships between these objects and trans bodies, and also my body and the objects that I make with in my practices, my creative practice, because these are like material things. And so I feel like research creation allows me to kind of like pull all these things together and think of these things kind of side by side and shifting between the material practices, the material things themselves, bodies, and also conceptually. So I find that there's a lot of like generative research creation practices are very generative in ways to to address things that are maybe a little sticky and a little bit difficult in ways that kind of like can be outside of the same ways that we're reiterating the same time of discourses and same time of approaches to some subjects. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this theme of embodied knowledge, embodied research is so key when we're talking about research creation, which to me is so much about like knowledge production does not just happen verbally or through the written word or cerebrally, like, you know, the mind-body divide, like it's so silly. But still so much of what we engage with in academia is written or verbal and is not that accessible. So one of the things I was doing in this project with Hex was we were working with Queer Phenomenology, which is a text by Sarah Ahmed. I'm sure lots of folks are familiar with it. And it's so interesting because phenomenology is the study of lived experience and this idea that, you know, we're embodied in the world and our consciousness arises through our engagement with the world, et cetera. So it's really kind of a simple, intuitive, I think, way of being. Like you look at children and that's how they're living, but the texts, especially the early texts, can be so dense and so hard to read. And I mean, Sarah Ahmed comes about it, makes it a lot more readable, I think. She's talking about orientation, like the phenomenological orientation, that's spatial and relational dimensions, and talks about disorientation as a form of kind of like a queer space-making practice, but still rather dense. So we took bits of that text and we wrote in and around it in kind of a creative response way. We started responding to one another. We turned it into poetry. And then we're also talking about how a lot of the themes and the ideas that are coming up in this work are already present in the spaces, the virtual communities that we're living in. So how else can we expand these ideas or kind of bridge them between this academic writing and these spaces that already exist, where sometimes this academic writing comes out of, can be kind of extractive as well. So it was very much about then the aesthetic practice and like what's the environment we're building? What is the nonverbal sound? How is your body moving through this space? And how then are you responding with it in this way that, I mean, I feel like I'm saying nonverbal so many times, but what's happening there that's below or beneath or alongside of or beyond language, which again, I think is also very key. Like if I could write it down, I'll write it down. But if it's something, it's an idea, then I can't, then I'm going to make art. That's like one of my basic key things.
I'll just pick up on that because I see a connection the same way that like theory and academic jargon can be very intimidating. Technical knowledge can be very intimidating. Trying to understand how technologies that work on such a massive scale can be very intimidating and also kind of dry occasionally. So it's about RC in the context of my project is really about opening up these technologies in ways that is just playful, experimentational, very kind of intelligible or accessible. Because if I'm just talking about, you know, this is how a computer vision algorithm is trained or XYZ, it becomes very dry. It becomes less compelling. And it's really just a lot more fun for me to just kind of say, you know, this is what we experience, inputs and outputs. What can we learn from this? Or what type of knowledge is mobilized by just exploring these things rather than focusing on the kind of opacity or the intimidating black box, so to speak.
Thank you for that. And I guess, T, you mentioned this to a certain extent, but I couldn't help but notice that all of you, or at least a large majority of you, are doing workshops. So what do you think the kind of collective, this kind of way of addressing research creation through collective work and experimentation adds to like the overall process or outcome of your research creation project?
Yeah, I'm doing a workshop on like basically giving a bit of a talk about interactivity and why we, I think, are desiring more interactivity, which is kind of in line with what we were talking about with research creation, like moving away just from, I guess, more like passive forms of engaging with things to being kind of more hands-on, and then giving a workshop with the auscultation mic. So I'm gonna give everyone a snack and then they can hear their gut sounds and we can kind of play with it. And I think that being able to kind of play those things out allows you to kind of test the theory too. Like my research looks at
why interactivity and participatory art and things have become kind of like more dominant. You kind of get more artworks that you walk by that you like can wave at and it kind of waves back to you, and you have more participatory forms where like the collective is kind of the basis of the artwork, where it wouldn't exist without it. And I think that a lot of theory, talks about that art, and I think that the trying out the theory by doing the art and having an aesthetic experience with other people allows you to kind of, again, get into that iterative process where you're like, where does the theory kind of fall short? Where does it land? What do we need to kind of amend to make those two things like hopefully closer together and improve upon both?
Yeah, I also think, my work is very community-based because I think in academia it's very problematic, the kind of divide between the researcher and the participant, or the researcher and the public, this kind of objectivity. And this falls within a larger kind of framework of feminist citational ethics, non-Western indigenous practices of citational ethics, and kind of where we're getting our knowledge from. And so I think workshops are so important, and kind of having these interactivity is so important for furthering knowledge in a way that's still contextualized in like the lived realities of what we're doing. Yeah.
Sure. I haven't thought about this so much, to be honest. It's and I think this, for me, this impulse of having the workshop, it doesn't come from an academic place. It comes from more of an activist place. This is just what I'm kind of used to doing in my activism that is not necessarily in the university. And I guess this active, of course, in terms of ideas, it relates to feminist ideas and feminist ideas of interdependence, right? We're all together and we all live together. That's how we're doing things. And if I have the opportunity to have a space and have a time, of course I'm going to invite friends from the communities that I'm connected to make stuff together and to share what I'm into with these communities. So, and I think it makes more sense also, transness is also relational. So my ideas around transness, trans embodiment, trans as a concept, it makes sense to do that through collectives as well. But also just because it's fun. I have fun making this stuff and I love it so much, and I just want to share my geekiness with other people. But that's the basic of it, really.
And since I'm doing a workshop as well, I'll just chime in. I think the fear with quite a bit of the work that I do is that I just am too close. I become, this autoethnographic subject, and I assume that my reaction to something is going to be kind of this universal interpretation. And, generally that's not the case. So you don't want to lose your audience by being immersed in your own photographs or anything else. You want to kind of take a step back and see how other people are relating to the technologies, because even though these things are interacted with intimately, lots and lots and lots of people have pretty unique experiences of them and unique ways of making sense of them. And I don't want to close myself off to that too much, right? I want to see things through other people's eyes and other ways of relating to a technology that's kind of pervasive, but is still primarily interacted with privately.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. And I kind of like this last theme that has broadly to do with new media or the digital, since this is relevant to a lot of your projects, but also not all of yours. I'd be interested to hear about the other side as well. But anyway, my question is, I'm kind of coming from a place where I've done a lot of reading in media archaeology, and within this space, there's a lot of skepticism that kind of unpacks or critiques this notion of new technology or new forms of communication. And some of your projects, particularly Chris, T, Ben to a certain extent in terms of Google Maps, and Alina, of course, is very centered around kind of the more novel features of new media, such as VR immersion or AI photography. And I think that these interventions that you're making almost has the potential to make some sort of critical counter critique to these like more skeptical media archaeologists that claim that new technologies are kind of repeating older logics. So for those of you engaged in new media or the digital, I'm curious about how you think about the particularity of new media in your work, what it adds to research creation or just your object of inquiry more generally.
Okay, I guess I'll say something. Oh, wow, that's a big question. Thanks for asking that. I don't know. I mean, I think VR is an interesting case, and maybe you can speak to this as well. I know you work with VR as well. That for the last several decades now, there's been this promise that we're going to be living in this virtual world, and it's going to be kind of dystopian, and you're going to lose your physical body. And I mean, there's an aspect of that. I think that's all really interesting. And I think how VR, well, a lot of emerging technologies are represented in science fiction, often with this dystopian bent, is a really interesting way of looking at it critically. But I think can also be a little bit narrow. This and all that to say, like, it has not caught on. And even though I'm deeply immersed in VR and never expected to find myself here, I don't think it will. Like, the headsets can get smaller and smaller, but not that many people want to wear a toaster on their head for several hours at a time. It's not super comfortable. It's not super accessible if you have any form of motion sickness or something. Like, it's not that pleasant. I see it honestly as a kind of a niche thing. I think AR and XR, if we're talking about wearable technology, are more like realistic. It will be more widely adopted. That's just my hot take. But I think this idea, I think it's novel. I think there's a novel aspect to a lot of these technologies, but I think the reason that we connect with them and why it takes off in some cases is because it's tapping into something that is old in us, or we connect with it a certain way. Like, I'm really into everything I just described because I'm meeting people and having relationships that touch upon, ways that I enjoy being in the physical world. So that answer is maybe a little sunshiny. So I'd love to hear some more critical takes, but those are my thoughts.
I guess I could be the party pooper take. I don't know. I feel like I could kind of jump on the media archaeologist bandwagon a bit with kind of critiquing some of these technologies. I feel like I come from that perspective more, even though I do work in them, ironically. But yeah, I think what I was touching on very briefly earlier was like VR and these emergent technologies do have like long histories and really do have kind of discourses that reach back and like have practices. It sort of emerged through kind of practices that are really kind of heavily linked to kind of discourses of colonialism, of extraction, of capitalism. VR was a military invention as well. So it has kind of these like, I guess, darker histories or kind of deeper histories to them as well. But I do also come from a more optimistic side as well, especially as I was saying with this project. And I would say kind of thinking about, especially with research creation and access and wanting to kind of make or imagining a world where kind of VR and new media is kind of more accessible to wider audiences. I feel like kind of the future for me for new media, or the exciting thing of it, is when it is kind of accessible to people and when it is more kind of DIY and like not like this really far off technological sci-fi world, and really can be accessible to a lot of people. I guess that kind of answers two sides of that question. Yeah.
I have something to say about my own project in relation to this, but I also just like a side note or an offshoot, like what you were saying, T, about the idea that like VR, like maybe it won't catch on in such a widespread way was like kind of interesting to me because I was like, oh yeah, what if there was like, because we often think of like new technology as in this like, it's going like broad overarching, I'm a hand talker, so I keep wanting to take the microphone away from my mouth when I'm talking to use my both hands, so I'll just use this one. But like we think new technology, oh, it's just gonna overtake and be this whole new thing. But what if there's like actually an offshoot that's like, it's still like used, but it's like more like a niche. Oh, just that's an interesting like concept to me, and like, and maybe it, in those ways it can be made like still more accessible, but it's like this offshoot niche, or like you're saying, like an underground community or something. So that was just something interesting made me think about. But yeah, for me, when you're asking about what does new technology, like new media specifically, bring to like research creation project, for me, it's like in this case, with my project, it was a relationship between the old and the new technology, because the only reason we were able to access all these films beginning from 1920 for the next 100 years was through YouTube and Dailymotion and through like streaming sites and like things where people were like, I guess technically illegally uploading them. And like oftentimes we would have a clip stored in like the Excel sheet or whatever, and we go and click on it, be like, this video has been removed, like for copyright reasons or whatever. So it was like, that was the way that we could access all these older films. And then digital editing software was the way that we could, and like the ability to like download, like rip from YouTube, like this kind of thing was how we could like remix the material. Like not only our way of studying it and having to scrub back and forth and be like move frame by frame to see exactly what the woman's shoulder was doing or whatever, it was also how we could then put it together into this new piece. And a large part of the work for me was not only, you know, shooting the film and adding the clips over top of it afterwards, it was downloading files, numbering them, cataloging them, like doing all this stuff. So as a research and a research creation tool, it was like a way to bridge with older media as well as like remix it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can take a step back and just kind of point to some things that make me think that there is something kind of new happening. And, you know, I've positioned my own research kind of past the analog versus digital photography debate, because, you know, that's pretty well-worn territory at this point. But at the same time, I mean, there's a difference, right? Like, where are the photographs? Or what does a photograph mean to me versus someone who was born 10 years ago? Like, it's a different thing. So I'm still touching on a lot of those themes, and we see that there's this kind of notion that like a picture is forever, but you know, we don't end up printing them, and then the cloud dies, or any number of things can happen. So I feel as though those differences are real, and you know, you can't pretend as though everything changes everything. There's developments and there are histories that need to be acknowledged, but at the same time, we're in uncharted territory. And to pretend as though we aren't, to pretend as though there's this kind of like legacy of things that set this extreme precedent and things will just unfold in the same way over and over again, is, I think, maybe somewhat misguided. And I wanted to kind of like bring this up because it just struck me when we were talking about VR and this kind of new level of immersion. And I'm thinking of one photograph right here that's been on behind Jesse and Ben's head. And it's a television screen, and Elvis famously shot his TV when it had like some sort of Robert Goulet broadcast. And I think it just kind of brings us back to this idea of like, how were we relating to media at a certain moment in time? Or what is the symbolic gesture here? This is before a first-person shooter game existed. This is before VR, and yet there was some kind of impulse within Elvis to like see an image and react in this physical way. And, you know, like, I think all these things do have histories. I think they're unfolding in very bizarre ways right now. And, you know, we can acknowledge those histories and still accept that we are kind of in a new space.
Could have taken the other mic. But yeah, building upon that, I think the idea of like, with digital versus analog or anything like that, is the idea of the archive is an interesting question there, like how things, like what's the staying power? And I think that, you know, the unforgettability of digital technologies is sometimes where I go like, oh God, like, you know, whereas like you could maybe lose some photos if they're kind of physical prints and stuff, like the memory, looking at your stuff, Chris, that the technologies have now, it kind of, it affects your experience in a different way because you have to be conscientious of what you're doing with respect to them. So it shapes what you're doing, and it shapes the way that kind of you live your life without even realizing it. Like, I hate that I had a Facebook profile when I was like in 4th grade. Like, why was that allowed? And like the memory of that is there, you know, and I think that the archival aspect of it poses like interesting questions also just for, you know, these new technologies in terms of, you know, surveillance and stuff and how your data is being collected and what's being done with it. It's not so private.
That also makes me think, it's a bit adjacent, but also makes me think of when you have too much capacity for the archive, it almost loses what you have as well because of the ability to find things. So there's kind of the inverse of something that's kept forever. It's like you can't keep everything forever because then you have nothing, you know. It's a bit aside, but it makes me think of that.
Yeah, it's the difference between like, you know, information versus kind of like something that you want to preserve.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so this has been a very like digital oriented conversation. So for those of you who maybe thought about using new media, or maybe didn't think about it, but decided to use analog media, what led to this? And was it a rejection, or was it more of an intention towards what the analog media could do that maybe the new media couldn't? What played out in those decisions?
I could start us off. I kind of touched on this. I kind of touched on this a little bit already. I don't want to repeat myself, but I think even though I'm using analog technology, it's still very much tied to the impacts of digital technologies and sort of a commentary on them. And I am using, you know, the photographic practices analog in this case, but of course I'm using Google Street View in my work as well. And so I'm talking kind of about the tension of those things. And my intentionality behind it was really, I feel like in my photographic practice, I'm always waiting for someone to tell me to stop or to, no, but it's a real fear. Like I was taking pictures of a ceiling in a building and there was not a single person in the photo. And then this person came over and was like, "Are you taking pictures of me?" And I was like, "My camera's pointed directly at a ceiling." No, I was like, "No, you're not in the photo." And he was very upset. But, you know, so I'm kind of walk around with that fear when I'm taking photos. And so I think I have larger questions about how does this anxiety how does this anxiety potentially shift and change output and artistic expression and art and photography specifically in my case. And, you know, I think about the digital technologies existing and digital surveillance and how it may be, you know, sort of an aggressor to people and thinking more critically about surveillance and if they're being watched or how. And certainly there's a lot of rhetoric today around data and how it's stored, and there's just a lot of conversations, right? And people are concerned about privacy. And I think when I go out and take photos, it's this very, to me, innocent thing that's just about my own artistic expression. And people and companies and organizations are taking data in much more sort of insidious ways with exploitation at the center of, you know, what they're doing. And that's not at all what I'm doing. And so I think that sometimes photographers bear the brunt of that anxiety and that concern in maybe unfair ways. And that's something that I was thinking through in this project. So for me, it was important to start with analog photography because in my thinking as I do it, I'm contemplating the fact this isn't going into the internet. But, you know, very quickly, that isn't really the case with many analog photographers, right? They get posted online and, you know, in Instagram, and they're enmeshed, certainly. And I have digital practices in my own analog work because I scan those photos through a scanner and then they go into a digital software where I'm then like touching them up, and they're not separate at all, you know? But it was kind of just to touch on maybe the difference and some nuance there. So that was kind of my intention with starting at analog, but of course they're not separate. And I use digital practices in my work all the time. But it was sort of just a way to kind of drive a bit of a point, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my work is very, I guess, analog focused, but as we've all kind of touched on, like there's no separation. Like I began with textiles, and a big part of wanting to do these rust prints was kind of creating this other archive in a sense of these kind of spaces and that I've interacted with. But then and craft is really considered as an analog practice. And I think kind of craft, we've moved beyond not thinking of craft as art, I think, but there has been kind of a long history of craft as a woman's work kind of practice as being really like separated from art and kind of really in this private sphere of like the home and practicality. But what I love is, and Concordia has a lot of resources for it, but so many of these practices have been digitized as well. Like my piece is covered in embroidery that's primarily used with a digital embroidery machine through a process of taking photos of these rust prints and then going in Illustrator, outlining them, and then putting them into a different software and printing them. And that allows for an entirely different texture and affordance than hand embroidery would. And also just the sheer amount of time, you know, like to hand embroider like a 1 by 2 meter piece would take hours and hours and days of work and broken fingernails, stabbed thumbs, you know. But what's interesting is over this process for me, I think I started with having a lot of like, I wanted to focus analog because I'm quite suspicious of kind of this digital idea of intimacy. And while I think there's a really beautiful side of it, I think there's really, with a lot of digital work, there's this smoothing out of human error, which now I know from a lot of animation is so not true, but yeah, there's kind of this lack, I think, in getting these smooth edges. And I feel a lot of anxiety in my work a lot of the time, and that it's almost impossible to make something by hand entirely perfect in the same way that you could get a computer rendering of it. And I really love this kind of beauty of texture and human error and the hand that goes into it. Where was I going with this? But yeah, I guess just saying that it's completely not separated from the digital world, because everything we do, even like, you know, our audio clips, like I put it into a digital audio workspace to edit it. They're heavily modulated and automated clips, like they're not kind of raw. Yeah, I don't know where I was going. No end point, but I'm ending. I love it.
Yeah, I think I feel a lot of things very similar to you, Jesse, in your own practice and in mine. I think craft is also an important element of my practice. And I relate it to the ways that trans embodiment is also crafted with these different objects that I study, right? Like these prosthetics and these garments. So, and then this crafting is, of course, like a very DIY type of crafting, right? It's a handmade practice. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in this handmade. And I kind of arrived to analog filmmaking because I was doing digital documentary filmmaking. And then on the side, I was also doing like painting, for example. And then I kind of like, I felt like this analog filmmaking was kind of like bringing these two practices together, and then just like echoed in so many ways that made sense with the ways that I was thinking through different concepts, different ideas. So there's definitely something like this. There's something about rummaging through the garbage of the world, you know, like going through these like bins of old film, being able to make other things with it after. With the many practices of found footage can be material, can also be digital, right? And there is kind of like an aspect that you find in like this. So there's communities and there's collectives also of digital, so not digital but analog filmmakers. That is kind of like making things with objects that have existed for a really long time. I have my 60 millimeter projector here. I bought it secondhand off of Marketplace. It cost $100. It's like fairly accessible materials somehow, also kind of niche. You do have to find them. But for me, there is like an echo, and it's not necessarily intentional, and I don't want to like declare any form of purity, but I think there is something about an anti-capitalist, I don't know, positionality, thinking about that, of like my $100 16 millimeter projector bought off of Marketplace, off of Francois, who is this? Thank you, Francois. But like, is a very different economy than buying. Like VR now belongs all to Meta, right? Like, but like a lot of it, like I don't know, like I feel like there's these things, I don't know, different economies, right? These are working, different technologies work in different economies, and there's no purity. Like I'm not in a form of purity either with what I'm making, but there is this. I think I'm drawn toward analog making because of this as well. Yeah.
And just to respond to that, Raf, going back to intimacy, I wonder if, like, I know you're not coming from a purist or like Luddite position or anything, but because there are important interventions being made at in the digital sphere as well. But I wonder if what you're saying can kind of be thought of as or this turn to the analog can kind of be thought as a kind of refusal with respect to what you were saying earlier about like intimacy and the feeling of sometimes forced intimacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there is somehow more control of the archive, right? Because what you're making analog, like in analog, is not kind of, you can, and it probably often does find itself on the internet, but there's a bit more of a control within, and it's not only the material itself, but it's for me, it's also the practice that I have with the material. Mm-hmm. So it's working more towards abstract images, which is also a refusal of transparency.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, great. I think we have like 10 minutes left. I have like 2 more specific questions, but before, I've been talking a lot and asking my own questions, but I want to like open the floor for any of you if you have questions for each other's more specific projects, or anybody online has questions. But yeah, I just wanted to open the floor before I do an individual interrogation. Okay, does anyone? Oh, or anyone in the audience? Sorry. Yes, Steph, please.
Great, thanks. Thanks, everybody. I'm really excited to see your pieces, and it's been really wonderful to hear you talk about so many different aspects of the exhibition and working together. I think my main question is around how I really appreciate your integration of Lauren Berlant and her work as a framework to see intimacy and understand intimacy in different ways, because it's one of those things that fades into the background, I think, sometimes as we go about our lives. And with digital technologies, also, these become part of our habits and everyday lives. And so I was wondering, what thinkers or what ideas are you using to really think through the digital side, right? Because Berlant was kind of thinking on this bigger side of society, but what helps you think through the digital? And some of it's been discussed in terms of media archaeology, but are there other frameworks that you've found to be really helpful?
This is a text I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and Steph, I know you're familiar with this text, but Glitch Feminism by Legacy Russell, yeah, a lot of nods, has been, for me, such an integral text, very accessible. It's a manifesto. She's a queer Black feminist performance practice who talks about coming of age in like internet culture, online identities, forming relationships, so obviously very related to my practice, but more broadly talks about the digital breakdowns and also the physical breakdowns, like when bodies glitch, when queer bodies glitch, when they appear when any of us appears in a non-normative way and doesn't fit, and looking at those glitches as opportunities for social revolution, or what happens there, and not reading it as like a mistake or an error, or if it is an error, it's a productive error. So for me, and I'm wondering, I guess I'm kind of taking over the question. Anybody else relate to that text, or other texts that are important to us?
Definitely relate to that text, especially the kind of like forms of refusal and non-participation. I love that we were talking about refusal, which brings me to another text that's interesting and integral to my work from an art historian perspective, which is Janet Cranach's The Digitization of Everyday Life. And she takes up different case studies and kind of does a deep dive into the history of the internet as an introduction, and then looks at how art mobilizes different technologies and what the impacts of those are. Although at times a little, I think, too critical, she has some really interesting perspectives.
Yeah, when I was kind of working on my piece, I was reading, actually Kristen introduced me to Byung-Chul Han, the German philosopher, and he's actually very critical of the kind of the turn to the digital and the sort of replacement of objects and artifacts with just information, and kind of his one book that I was reading, Saving Beauty, which is kind of looking at aesthetics in the digital age, kind of he has this big emphasis on texture and kind of the smoothing. I mentioned it a bit before, I guess, the smoothing out that happens in the digital, and kind of like how we relate to beauty and art in an era where so much of our lives exist within this information kind of exchange, and how this information exchange is so tied to productivity and capitalism, basically. Like, what does art mean?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Not so specific to this project, but something that's been informative for me in like my research more generally, having to do with digital technology and dance, is there's been a lot of work done, like creative projects as well as scholarship, on the idea that using digital technology, specifically like visualization and stuff, will allow sort of the invisible embodied knowledge that dancers have to become visualized. Like there's projects that will use so they map the spatial, like the pathways of dancers through space, the ways they take up volume and stuff, and then create these different visualizations. There's projects based on like choreographer William Forsythe's piece called One Flat Thing Reproduced, that was done at Ohio State University, I think. And then also in Germany, a project called Motion Bank that was, a lot of people worked on it, but one of the lead people on it was a scholar named Scott De La Hunta, and he's also written about this idea that these ways of visualizing like physical knowledge, things that are ephemeral and disappear when people enact them and do them, are ways to make this become more apparent. There's another project, and I can't remember the name of the people who did it, unfortunately, right now, but the name of the project is called Dunham's Data, which is based on Black dancer Catherine Dunham, and it's collecting all the data of where her dance troupe toured throughout the world, and so making like an archive out of this and mapping different ways of visualizing this, like different kinds of graphs and maps and this kind of stuff that all this stuff would maybe otherwise be lost. But yeah, so that's something that I'm in other things that I think about, I return to a lot, is work on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, just briefly, the notion of the ephemeral, not so much in relation to dance, but in relation to digital technologies and archival technologies, and the idea that, digital material only exists in the way that we encounter it when we call upon it to. Otherwise, it exists as code, right? We kind of animate it ourselves by choosing to interact with it or to call it to life. So it's a different materiality, and that's something that's been explored in the notion of the enduring ephemeral by Wendy Chun, who's been influential also for kind of exploring the consequence of the biological abstraction of memory into computing. Like, we use the term memory to refer to storage in our computers. That's not a coincidence. And it certainly changes the way, we think about how we recall in relation to technology.
I'm really excited by this one text. I'm blanking on the author, but it's fairly recent. It's called volumetric regimes. And it's very similar to kind of the themes on this side of the table. And for anyone that's kind of working in VR or like 3D world, kind of commenting on kind of the smoothing out of kind of the 3D world and kind of introducing kind of this feminist glitch perspective as well has been really interesting. And for my work overall, kind of thinking with kind of these 3D technologies now, kind of, just thinking about thinking about volume otherwise, essentially.
I think this theme of smoothness for me comes up a lot, especially in my practice, because I think that the smoothness that's afforded to me because of digital technologies is something that comes up a lot. And for example, even for the work that I have, I had to go back to the film to scan it, and there were all these fuzzy pieces of material stuck onto the film, and I couldn't scan it. I scanned it at a higher resolution to print it, and I couldn't edit them out because there were so many of them. And I was like, oh my God, this film is ruined, and I need to have it at a higher resolution in order to print it, and I don't know what to do. And then I figured out, I got rubbing alcohol and Q-tips and figured out how to clean it properly. But I think thinking about smoothness in sort of a different way, but how it's an affordance really for me in my actual practice and in my work, and what it kind of brings me and sort of the output. Yeah.
Okay, we're at 11:59. So we're at time. But yeah, thank you everyone for a delightful conversation. I learned a lot. It was very enriching, and thank you for our in-person audience and online audience for coming. And also thank you to Fourth Space for all of the cool high-tech technological features.
Thanks, everybody. All right, maybe just a few words. Thanks again so much for making the time to come together here this morning. We really appreciate you and those of you who came in as audience members online or in person. A little quiet online, but I know that's a lot to take in, a lot of voices and ideas coming at you at once. So we appreciate you sitting in and listening to these folks speak about their work. Speaking of their work, while I have you here, I hope that we can convince you all to stick around for a little bit in the space so that we could actually do a bit of a video kind of tour of your projects in the space now that they've come together. You spent all day setting them up yesterday, and we hope to be able to give folks online a glimpse of what's in the space if there's time for it. We'll talk. We'll end this Zoom now and stream, and hopefully be able to record something with you. Okay, everyone, thanks, and have a great afternoon until the 2 p.m. today for the first workshop, if you're coming to that, and come back and see us tomorrow for more conversations and workshopping. Thanks, everyone. Take good care.